Thanks for letting me come here. This is such a wonderful facility that Kevin and his wife have done. This church is just awesome. And the setting, too, with the historic house nearby is just the perfect place to have Earth Day. What we were talking about was fracking, and I know I'm probably talking to the choir in this one, but as I explained to folks who are not familiar with it, fracking is where you take perfectly good, healthy drinking water, intentionally contaminate it, ram it down in the ground where you don't know where it's going, at the rate of about 3 million gallons every 5 days in a state that has periodic droughts, fracture the surface of the earth, suck it back out, go find an injection well to stick it in, and hope that nothing bad goes wrong. And when the Republicans put forward their bill on fracking, they put $500 million in the bill for well damage, and then said they weren't going to damage any wells. Well, who are they kidding? They may have underfunded the bill, but they sure never overfund one. And so it's a real problem. It's made a worse problem in North Carolina because the Triassic Basin, where the shale sands reserve exists, are notorious for fracturing in such a way that you can't track where the water would be going. Worse than that, in North Carolina, our shale gas reserves are closer to the water than any other place in the nation. And on top of that, the predictions are that you wouldn't need any shale gas from North Carolina for another 10 years because of the reserves in other places. And then the folks want to make an argument based on jobs and manufacturing. Well, fracking is already being done in other places. As a result of that, all of the manufacturing for fracking equipment is already being done. So it doesn't bring any manufacturing to the state. Worse than that, there are only 200 folks in the state identified who know how to frack. And so most of the jobs would go to people from out of state. And the predictions from DENA are that in the first year of fracking, whenever they get around to doing that, there would only be 59 jobs. Well, you have 59 jobs with fracking and thousands of jobs with tourism and other things, and the balance is just completely out of whack. I can't see a good reason to get into fracking in this state at this time at all. Now, whether a dozen years from now or 10 years from now, a decade away, whether there's technology that could make that a safe thing to do, well, that's something we'll have to wait for the decade to pass to see. But there's no reason to go and support it now. As y'all may have heard, the Republican legislature is so bent on doing this that they've been running a study committee, and they're coming forward to try this fracking bill again. The governor has vetoed their current fracking bill. In fact, what they did is they came forward with a bill that said that we'll approve fracking and then we'll study it. Generally, you study things and then decide whether to approve it, not the other way around. But that was the bill that they passed. Fortunately, the governor vetoed it. I stand with the governor on the veto, as do a number of other people, sufficient number that they haven't been able to override the veto. Doesn't stop them from coming in this next time, which will be in just a few weeks, and to try to run through another fracking bill. Well, whatever they've got in mind, if it involves contaminating our water intentionally, and then going forward to frack in a state that has the challenges we have in an economic environment where it's not needed, I'm going to continue to oppose it. And of the three principal Democratic candidates running, I'm the only one running who outright opposes fracking. The other two say they're good with it. Of course, they would like to see some more studies, but I think we know enough to have a position now. And just so if it makes any difference to you, the positions I've taken in the House have always been on the environmental side of the world. For example, when we were requiring renewables as part of the energy package from the energy company, I supported that. And another example is where mercury switches. You know, there are mercury switches in cars. That's how the car knows whether for the light to come on in the trunk when the trunk's open and to go off when it closes. In the older cars, it's a mercury switch. And so legislation was developed to reclaim those mercury switches and keep them from spilling mercury into the ground. Another thing that I supported over time. You all may not know about this one because it's out in the western part of the state, but back in the early 50s, the Alcoa company obtained a license to run a aluminum smelting plant, which hired a lot of people, obtained the license to dam up some rivers and take the use of the public water for the use of those plants because it was creating jobs. Well, they're no longer smelting aluminum, and so they're no longer hiring anyone. But they still want the license to use our water because it's going to make them $51 million over the next 10 years. And it makes no sense to me that at times when we don't have enough money to fully fund education, that we should be taking a public resource, turning it over to a private company for private profit from the company with no job benefit in the state. Worse than that, turning it over to a company that's broken their promise to the state. It's that promise that got them the license to begin with. And so, on top of everything else, I oppose Alcoa getting a free run at our water supply for corporate profit without providing some balance of jobs to go along with it. And any questions you have, I'll be glad to answer. They're using it to manufacture electricity with. And then they're taking the, yeah.
Who do they sell the electricity to?
Why, the public, of course.
But isn't most of it actually in Virginia?
Well, I don't know where it all goes, but what I know is it's just a bad idea to turn over a public resource to a private company when they've breached their contract or breached their agreement. There are too many other things we could do with that, and there are too many other needs that we have. And we've just got to be smart and practical about what we're doing and how government's providing services. You know, 55% of the money that's collected in taxes goes to education. Roughly 55% of the income that comes into the state comes from personal income tax. Roughly 25% of the money goes to health and human services, primarily Medicaid. And roughly 26% of the money coming in comes from sales tax. Almost balances it out. And roughly 10% of the money goes to prisons, and roughly 10% of the money comes from real estate transfers. That's 91% of the money and 90% of the expenditures. 7% comes from corporate income tax. But did you know that the corporations in this state, of the corporations, 65% of the regular C Corps pay no income tax? None at all. And they do that because they've been able to afford over the years to hire the lobbyists to come to Raleigh to get them the tax loopholes so they don't pay the tax. And part of what I'm proposing as a jobs plan for the state involves a smart tax policy and a redistribution of some of those corporate loopholes to the small business people in the state. Y'all probably know this, but there are only 3 states in the union worse off for unemployment than we are. We have roughly 472,000 people out of work. Our unemployment rate has been hovering around 10%, unless you're African American, and then it's 20%. And it's now taking longer than any time in the last 60 years to find a job, and if you lose a job, the new job is really at about a 17.5% cut in pay. In fact, I was at the Mini Mart the other morning getting gas, and I was talking to the lady behind the counter who told me that she lost her $42,000 a year job 2 years ago, has been diligently trying to find work ever since, has been working part-time at the convenience store, finally found work, and she found it at a salary of $26,000 a year. She took a $16,000 a year cut in pay just to finally get a full-time job. And that is an endemic problem across our state. I am the only Democratic candidate for governor with a jobs plan. In fact, for that matter, I'm the only candidate for governor in either party with a jobs plan. The plan involves reenacting only a fraction of the penny sales tax that expired last summer, 7 cents on a $10 purchase. It would rehire all the teachers, teachers' aides, state employees, and private sector folks who lost their job in the Republican budget, a little over 36,000 people. It would then involve a smart tax policy taking away some of these corporate loopholes for the large corporations. The Republican legislature this time around, while taking our educational spending per pupil down to 49th nationally, gave the multi-state corporations another $38 million tax loophole, tax break. They did this, it's an interesting little trick. I'll use Nike as an example because they're not here. But if Nike were in North Carolina and we're making $100 million, what Nike's home office could do is charge the North Carolina operation its entire net operating revenue for the use of the swish and move all the money out of state and never pay any income tax on it. And what it ends up doing is putting all the cost of services on the backs of the rest of us and not on the backs of the large corporations who are here. And then the final piece on the jobs plan is we've got to get manufacturing back into eastern North Carolina. And textiles are gone and furniture is gone. And the only way we're going to get any manufacturing back of consequence, I think, is to use smart technology. You know, North Carolina's state universities are the 7th national leading holder of patents. North Carolina State University alone has over 700 and 192 pending. And there have been many a business started off of a single patent, off of just a single good idea. And we've got lots of them out there. We have business incubator systems that are through the universities, through the community colleges, and through the Rural Center. And what we need to do is be smart about marrying up our resources, which in this instance are those patents, and entrepreneurs and corporate interests to try to get the manufacturing going again. You know, when you look around, you realize that in the last, 7 years, maybe it's 5 years, is when iPhones and iPads first came along. Did you know that there are now 500,000 people employed doing apps for iPhones and iPads? That's more than our entire unemployment in the entire state. And it's just an example, though, of new technology and innovative thinking leading to additional jobs, a thing that we really do need to focus on. And so I'm Bill Faison. You can go see more about the jobs plan by going to my website. It's billfaison.com. There are all sorts of links in there. I've already debated Pat McCrory. I think you'll see we did very well in that process. There have been 4 gubernatorial debates already. Bob Etheridge and I have shown up for all 4. Walter Dalton showed up for 3. Of course, it's consistent with his record over at the Board of Education. As part of being Lieutenant Governor, he's on the State Board of Education. And I checked the other day, he's made it to, he's cut 25% of their meetings this year and in 2010. But it's better than he's doing over the community colleges. He's on their board also. He cut 45% of their meetings in 2009, 55% in 2010, and 62% of their meetings in 2011. And so that's kind of some of who's in this. Bob Etheridge is also in it. Etheridge is one of the congressmen who voted to send some of those jobs overseas and acknowledges that he did it. So I'm running for governor, and I'm happy to answer your questions, and I saw one in the back of the room.
Mr. Faison, I've been a classroom teacher now for 18 years. And in 18 years of education, I've had 5 years of stagnant salary. I'm being paid today as finishing up my 18th year of teaching as if I was a 14th year teacher. You know, the teachers get the step increase every year. So it's causing frustration on the side of teachers because we are experiencing zero advancement as far as our pay goes. What is your plan for helping us with these step increases in teacher pay?
Well, to give you a little background, in the last Democratic control legislature, part of the goal we had was to get teachers in North Carolina to the national average because teachers in North Carolina are below the national average in pay. So that was part of our goal to get that done. Now, one of the realities that we all face right now is that on the backside of the Great Recession, we've had something in the order of a $2 billion cut in receipts at the state level. with 45% of those already having gone to education, meaning that 45% of those somehow have to be dealt with in that process. There are really only three ways to deal with providing additional funding for areas such as education and government. One way is to do additional taxes. The fractional penny sales tax rehires the teachers and teachers' aides who were fired, but it doesn't do anything for the problem that you've identified, and it's very much a very real problem. The second thing to do is to reallocate the funds. Well, as I just went through with you a moment ago, 90% of the revenues go to three areas: education, health and human services, primarily Medicaid, and prisons. Well, I think one of the things we ought to be doing is looking to see the folks who are serving jail time for victimless crimes. And the question is, do we want people in jail being kept there by the rest of us and kept up there when the crimes they've committed don't really have a victim involved? There was a over-prediction of the rate of folks going to prison about 2 years ago. It really was sort of a blip or a bubble in their predictive process. But that little blip or bubble saved us $20 million in 1 year. $20 million. That's a lot of money at home. And so we need to be smart about that. But if we're looking at reallocations, one way to reallocate would be to reassess who we have in prison. Another thing that there's been a pilot project on with folks in prison are the ankle bracelets that allow you to identify using GPS technology where people are and to confine them to house arrest. That way their family gets to feed them and take care of them. It gets them out of the prison system and yet puts them essentially in timeout at home. And for folks who are not really a threat to do serious injury to another person, then maybe that's not a bad place for them to be. So we've got to be practical and use good common sense about our allocation of funds. And then the third thing is that the only other way to seriously raise revenues is to get our economy back on track. And people talk about it, and it's very true that we have a phenomenal education system. And I want to thank you for what you've been doing. Junior Atkinson reported the other day that this last year we had a higher high school graduation rate than at any time in the past, and a lower dropout rate. And so with the challenges our teachers face, with flat salaries for 4 years, and with inadequate funds for the classroom, they're still doing for us an absolutely phenomenal job. But what a better job they'd be equipped to do if we could appropriately honor them and pay them. And the key to that, I think, is ultimately the jobs plan that I've come forward with. Is there a better jobs plan? Well, there could be, but nobody's gotten one out there yet. And to provide leadership as governor, I mean, that's part of the job, is to try to fix the problems in the state, right? And the biggest problem is unemployment. And what goes along with getting people reemployed and re-energizing our economy is that the revenues begin to flow again as well. And if we're back where we were 4 years ago, you're talking about $2 billion more in funds without anybody's tax being raised at all, and putting us back on a track where we were to get teachers back to at least the national average in salaries. Yes, sir?
Why do Congress want to cut funding for education? Because it's needed for its job skills and future.
As best, I'm going to tell you about an argument we had in the floor of the House, and then I'm going to answer your question. The argument had to do with an identification card for folks who are not citizens. It's called the matricular consular. And the argument I made on the floor was that as a legislator body, we ought to be passing legislation to deal with identifiable problems. If there wasn't a problem, we ought to leave it alone. If there was a problem, then we ought to address the problem based on the facts that make up the problem and craft the best solution based on those facts. the majority leader, Skip Stam, with the Republicans, stood up on the floor of the House, said, and it's recorded so you can get a copy of it, said in that argument, said, Mr. Faison has confused where he is. He thinks he's in a courtroom where facts matter. This is the legislature. Facts don't matter here. Well, I think facts do matter. And I think you leave people alone every chance you get. And if you've got a problem, you craft the best solution you can for the identifiable problem. So we come back to your question, which is, why are the Republicans doing this? And in part, the answer that's so hard to get my mind around is that they're not doing it because there's a factual reason to do it for. They're doing it out of their ideology. Their ideology is cut government spending no matter the consequences. Well, they're not going to cut the prisons. They want to kill more people. They don't want to turn anybody loose. They have cut Health and Human Services, Medicaid, but they weren't smart about it. They cut $340 million out of Medicaid, but Medicaid is a program that's matched $2 and $3 of federal money for every dollar of state money. So what they did is, by cutting out the state money, they lost $660 million in federal money. Well, it was $660 million that was hiring people that is now gone, which means that in a state challenged after the recession by less jobs, they just took $660 million that could be used to employ people so they can make their house payment, their car payment, and send their kids to school, and shipped it back to Raleigh. Not because factually it's a good idea to do that, not because we don't have the need, not because the people who are economically challenged and that are aided by Medicaid didn't need the health care. They did it because of their ideology. And their ideology is to cut government spending, but not in prisons. And so they're cutting health services, but cutting it in a way that you're hurting the economy. It doesn't make any sense to me, but it's what they're doing. And it's part of the battle I've been up there in with them. But it doesn't just stop there. For example, they went after a woman's right to control her own body. I was one of only 3 men to stand up on the floor of the House and argue against that. I mean, it's absurd that they should be deciding what it is a doctor is going to say to a patient and what the patient's going to have to listen to from the doctor. They're not doctors. They don't know what they're doing. They went after not just the Racial Justice Act. The Racial Justice Act says that if you can show that the death penalty was imposed because of the color of your skin, the sentence is changed to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Well, who could ever think that anybody ought to be executed because of the color of their skin? It's just outrageous. And yet, when the Racial Justice Act was going through my Ways and Means Committee before the Republicans took over, every Democrat voted for it, every Republican against it. When it hit the floor of the House, every Republican voted against it, every Democrat for it, and it passed. And now they got in charge. One of the first things they did is step in and gut the Racial Justice Act. Now, Judge Greg Weeks down in Cumberland County just issued the first order under the Racial Justice Act this past Friday, determining that race was a factor in the imposition of the death penalty on a man in Cumberland County and changing the sentence to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And yet the Republicans have already voted to gut it. The governor has vetoed that. I stand with the governor on the veto. So what's the factual basis? Why would you want somebody executed or even have the possibility of him executed where race was a factor? I mean, it's just wrong, but it's where they are. But it's not just that. My sons and I hunt. I've hunted. I grew up on a North Carolina tobacco farm. I'm not going to that kind of restaurant. And if I were going in a bar and I thought it was one where somebody ought to give me a gun or a knife before I went in, I'd just go find a different bar. You know, it's not healthy. It's not a good idea, but it's what they do.
You touched upon this with education, but we do spend a lot per student in this state, but not a lot of it goes to the teachers. You know, we spend a lot of money, but a lot of it's wasted.
Well, it's not a lot of money Well, it's not a lot of money, though, relative to other states in the union.
Yeah.
When our spending per pupil is taken to 49th nationally, below Mississippi, we're not spending a lot on education, relatively speaking. And now, I should tell you that there are some other states that cut some of their spending. So last I heard, we're no longer 49th, we're all the way up to 42nd. I don't think that's anything to brag about, but that's where it is.
Yeah, I guess and this question might be a little off base here, but it does go back to education. I mean,
Partially to school construction. And what happened is in 2008, with the recession having started in 2007, supposedly, in 2008, the effects of the recession were being felt. And part of the lottery funds were used to keep teacher positions. It didn't leave education. It didn't go anywhere else. It went from bricks and mortar to people. And I voted for the lottery when it passed. It only passed by one vote. And I voted for the budget that reallocated the lottery funds to teachers, because as much as I like bricks and mortar, I like people being able to keep their houses and their cars. But all the money's still going into education. Now, and there are various formulas by which that happens. The last number I saw on the lottery was around $345, $350 million a year, which somebody was complaining was no money at all, but I kind of thought it was a bunch of money. And I'm glad to have it, because the thing that I believe that existed prior to us passing that is North Carolina had a lottery before 2005. It was just being run by South Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Virginia, and that's where all the money was going. And so by passing it, we kept some of it at home. We did funnel it into education. It'd be nice if there were more, but actually the first lottery bill that passed had prohibitions on advertising, so that you could have a lottery, but you couldn't advertise you had a lottery.
yeah, that was just kind of the quote. It just seemed to me like there would be a lot more proceeds, that's all.
Well, it'd be nice if there were.
Isn't some of the issue with that, though, is that the administration cost of the lottery is a lot more than they really planned, and the proceeds are not really going as much to education as they hoped, but to keep everybody working in the lottery.
Well, part of that has to do with the number of people playing, but it's true that the person who is the head of the lottery makes more money than the governor by a factor of 3, more money than the president of the consolidated universities by a factor of about 25 to 30%. So there is a significant disparity between how some of that money's spent. I agree with you. Doesn't make any sense to me. I couldn't believe what they were paying the person who was running it.
You don't have control over that as far as that's salary.
The legislature had to do the enabling legislation, but the legislature doesn't set salaries. There's a lottery commission that was set up. The lottery commission was set up to run it. There are various appointments made to it, some by the governor, some by the legislature. But it's then that commission which looks at other lotteries nationwide and then ends up structuring it. So the legislature rarely, if ever, micromanages anything, and that would be a micromanagement area. It generally authorizes, enables, and then there are various entities which are set up that oversee day-to-day operation.
I'm going to ask everyone Bill's going to stay around for a little bit, and I hope everybody gets a chance to meet him, and if you have any more particular questions, I'll let you field them at that time.
All right,
Thank
glad
you
to
very
do it.
much for coming and being a part of our Earth Day celebration.